He's a fan favorite and a major success story for the New York Jets. Now Quincy Williams is about to hit free agency. It should be a no-brainer the Jets bring him back, right? Well, I'm not so sure, and I'll explain why on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, February 24th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on the podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today we're talking free agency, and I'm going to give you some players who are about to hit free agency for the Jets that I'm not so sure they should bring back. You have to prioritize each year in free agency because, first of all, you have to try and improve your roster. You have to try and bring in players from the outside. And second, we obviously are in a league with a salary cap, so every dollar you spend on one player is a dollar you can't spend on another player. And I'm going to begin by talking about Quincy Williams. And this is going to be controversial because he's a fan favorite, and I think rightly so. This has been a tremendously successful addition for the Jets. The Jets got Quincy Williams, you may remember, off waivers from Jacksonville in 2021. He was originally kind of a fill-in guy. He was supposed to be a depth player. He was supposed to be kind of a backup. Jared Davis was hurt at the time. Williams played a couple games, was up and down. Davis came back, went back to the lineup, then kind of played his way out of the lineup. It was clear Quincy Williams was better than Jared Davis, so Quincy Williams took over the starting role, and it's one that he's kept. He kept it through the 2022 season. And you look at the waiver wire, you usually don't find a lot of great players there. And I think one of the things Joe Douglas has done well is he's really worked the waiver wire well. They've got John Franklin Myers off the waiver wire. They got Braxton Berrios off the waiver wire. This past year, they got Nate Herbig off the waiver wire. Joe Douglas's pro personnel record is kind of spotty, but one thing he's done very well is find players off waivers who help the Jets out. Now, you may look at this situation, you say Quincy Williams, Jets got him off waivers, he played very well for the team, the coaching staff seems to love him. He's the brother of the best player on the team, he's Quinnen Williams' brother. Of course you bring him back, right? As always, it depends on the price. And if the Jets can get Quincy Williams back for a cheap amount, a modest raise, say, good job, we're going to bump your salary up a little bit as a reward, then that's one thing. But some of the reports, and these aren't always accurate, and if these are wrong and Quincy Williams' price is going to be much cheaper, then my view on this would be different. But I've seen some suggestions from league insiders that Quincy Williams could be looking at a contract in the neighborhood of $8 to $9 million. And for me, that's a little bit too much money. In fact, I'd say it's more than a little bit too much money. I think that's too much money for Quincy Williams. The way I try and look at players like this is, and this is especially true on guys who are drafted day 2, day 3 of the draft. Your first 4 years of your career, you're practically making nothing. Your first rounders have it a little bit better. They still play at a discounted price if they're good, but once you get to like day 2, day 3, you're barely making above the minimum, and some guys are making in the neighborhood of the minimum. And the truth is, there aren't many players who are really highly paid on your roster. Most of your roster is filled with low-paid guys, at least relatively speaking, when we're talking NFL contracts. Most of those guys really don't produce a whole lot for you. So my view is that if you get a guy who's on a low salary who gives you anything, it's a benefit. It's a bonus because your expected return from somebody with a low salary is very little. That's the reason they have a low salary. If they were better, if you were expecting more, then you'd be paying them more. Some of those guys you get into trouble with because they play well and you really like them, but then they sign a contract for a huge raise, and suddenly they're not such a great value. I think another danger that you run into is you tend to overstate how much somebody brings to the table. I think some teams struggle with this, where maybe they're a little bit too loyal to their own players. And it's always a balancing act, because you don't want to be a team that's disloyal to players. You want to be a team that rewards players for good work. But you also don't want to overrate your own guys. An example of this, if you go back to 2016 would be Brian Winters, who had a solid season with the Jets in 2016. I don't think it was anything special. And the Jets kind of overrated him, and they gave him a contract that he never really lived up to. And even at the time, I did not think it was a very smart decision because Winters had not really been that great to that point. I don't think he earned the money that the Jets gave him. But the Jets just wanted to keep him because I think they liked him. I think they liked what he brought to the locker room. And I think maybe they overestimated how difficult it would be to replace him. And there are a couple of actually more recent examples of this with Joe Douglas. Now, one of them was in 2019 when the Jets, Ryan Griffin got off to this start of his Jets career where, essentially nobody was covering him in the red zone. So he put up a bunch of touchdowns and the Jets gave him an extension. Now, that was a case where, at the time, it seemed like it made no sense to me because Griffin really wasn't producing, and it was clear he was going to regress. Maybe a more relevant example would be the contract the Jets gave Braxton Berrios last year because I think, unlike Griffin's 2019, Berrios' 2021 season was good. He gave the Jets what they were looking for. He was a first-team All-Pro kick returner. He did a good job as a backup slot receiver. He helped move the chains in some clutch situations. But I think maybe the Jets overestimated how difficult it would be to replace him. And again, he was a fan favorite as well. He was a guy that was really liked in the locker room. He clearly had a friendship with Zach Wilson, who at the time was the quarterback the Jets viewed as their future. But I think the Jets, looking back, probably overpaid Berrios. Maybe they were a little too loyal. Maybe they, again, overestimated what Berrios brought to the table. And I think that's a danger you run into. It's always a balancing act because you want to make sure you keep guys who fit your system, and you want to make sure you reward guys who play well, but you don't want to go overboard with stuff like this. And I think if you look at this Jets roster right now, especially on the defensive side of the ball, where would you say the weaknesses are? I think you'd say one of the biggest weaknesses is probably the linebacker position. And I know C.J. Mosley was first-team All-Pro, and I know he made the Pro Bowl, but I don't think he had that kind of season. I don't think C.J. Mosley's horrible, but I don't think he really was as good as those accolades would suggest. Quincy Williams, again, I don't think he's a terrible player. I think he's a solid player, but he's the type of guy where I don't know that I like the idea of paying him. And I view him as kind of like, if you're familiar with baseball, I view him as one of those guys who hits a lot of home runs but also strikes out a lot. And I feel like at the linebacker position, the things you do well are obvious to everybody. So you deliver a big hit, you blitz and you get to the quarterback, people see that. The things you fail at are typically more subtle, and there's maybe, not showing good instincts in zone coverage or filling the wrong gap. And I think that's something Quincy Williams struggles with. I think Quincy Williams plays at times out of control, and sometimes that produces really good results because he's playing so aggressively and charging so hard that he delivers big hits. He can make plays behind the line of scrimmage. But that comes with a drawback, and the drawback's not always so obvious. Typically the way run defense works is linebackers and defensive linemen are assigned a gap. A gap is a space between offensive linemen or tight ends. So the spot between the center and the guard is a gap. The spot between the guard and the tackle is a gap. The spot between tackle and tight end is a gap. And typically your defensive linemen and your linebackers are assigned one specific gap that they have to cover. And if the run play goes to you, you got to make the play. And there's some nuance there. Sometimes you bring a safety in to cover a gap if there are too many gaps there are more gaps than defenders. Sometimes you'll actually have a defender cover two gaps. But Quincy Williams, you see some run plays go against the Jets where he's just filling the wrong gap. He's not where he needs to be. And part of the reason for that is that he's so aggressive that he's kind of he's overrunning the play. He's trying to make a play. And again, sometimes he does it. Sometimes he does it well. But there are also times where he doesn't do it. And I also don't think Quincy's a great cover guy. And for me, in today's NFL, if you're going to pay a linebacker, he probably should be able to cover. I can think of some exceptions, but this is a league where run defenders aren't that hard to find. It's not that expensive to find a run-stopping linebacker. It's really hard to find somebody who can man up with a tight end, who has the speed and the size to play one-on-one against the tight end, and also running backs. So I just don't think he'd be worth the money. It's not that I think Quincy's a bad player. And again, if I'm wrong, and if these projections are wrong, and Quincy's going to be much cheaper than people think, then I'd be open to having him back. I just feel like he's going to get too much money, and I think the Jets have other areas they have to prioritize. I don't think Quincy Williams is the type of guy you spend at the expense to keep at the expense of filling other needs that you've got. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll talk about another player that I'm not sure the Jets should bring back. I think more people will agree with me on this one. It's a guy they signed a couple of years ago to play tackle, a guy who's really had one good season out of 3 for the Jets. It's George Fant, and I'll explain more why I'm skeptical he's a guy the Jets should bring back as we continue this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat but you don't want all the fat and calories? Then you have to try Built Bar. We're approaching NFL free agency, and teams are going to be giving players signing bonuses. They're going to be giving them salary. However, they cannot give these players Built Bars. There are rules against circumventing the salary cap. However, you can try Built Bar because with Built, healthy is actually tasty. And they are so delicious that you won't think they're good for you. What makes these bars so good? Well, they're all covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. And now you don't need to wait around for a box. For years we've been talking about ordering your Built bars at Built.com. You can still do that, but now you can also go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club to get Built bars. So head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. And if you're so close to a Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box of hit flavors like brownie batter and churro. You can thank me later, and again, you can always go to Built.com to order these delicious Built bars. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. Today we're talking free agents the Jets probably should not bring back. And I hate to end the week on a negative topic, but you do have to prioritize as an NFL team. You can't always bring back every player who hits the open market. And in the first segment, I talked about Quincy Williams, a move, if the Jets let him go, that I'm sure will not be popular, and I'm sure not going to make me popular to say Jets should let a fan favorite player go. I think more people will agree with me on George Fant, and it's interesting because I think people probably would have agreed with me less a year ago when Fant was coming off a good 2021 season. He helped the Jets stabilize the left tackle position after Mekhi Becton got injured. 2022, however, was not Fant's year. He was injured early in the early part of the season. He was not playing all that well. He had to move. He was constantly moving. He was moving from left tackle to right tackle. Jets signed Dwayne. Jets originally put him at left tackle instead of Mekhi Becton. Then they switch him over because they signed Dwayne Brown to play left tackle, so Fant moves to right tackle. And we don't know whether he ever got healthy, but it just was not a very good season for him. Coming off, again, a very solid 2021 season, but a 2021 season where if you look at some of the numbers, you look at the number of pressures he allowed, you look at the extent to which the Jets helped him out, maybe it wasn't as good as it appeared on paper. Now, generally speaking, I don't think Joe Douglas has done a great job in free agency, and I think looking back in 2020, which was his first full offseason with the Jets, there's a move I wonder whether he'd want back, and that's the Jets really did not pursue Jack Conklin that hard. Conklin got a fairly big deal from the Cleveland Browns. At the time, I wanted Conklin, so maybe I'm a little biased in this. The Jets instead went with Fant, who I think they viewed as kind of like an upside type player. I think they were hoping that he was a player who was ascending. He was a guy who was new to the position of tackle. He actually did not have a lot of football experience. He had played some tight end. He'd moved to tackle. The Seahawks had gotten him, and they were trying to develop him, and he kind of developed through the years into a credible swing tackle. He was coming off a fairly decent season for Seattle, and the Jets, I think, were hoping that they were getting a player who was on the rise. And I think through 3 seasons, you probably would have to say that's not the case. I don't think Fant's a terrible player, but he has clear weaknesses. He's not really that helpful in the run game, and he's been very inconsistent through his career. Now, he can play left and right tackle. That's certainly something that's helpful. It's certainly something that helped the Jets quite a bit in 2021. But what's amazing to me is we've talked extensively, and I'm not the only one. I think a lot of people who've covered the Jets have talked about the challenges that they have at the tackle position. It's not really clear what they're going to do. I don't think you can count on Becton. What's Max Mitchell going to be? We don't really know. Dwayne Brown seems like he's at the end of his career. Is Elijah Vera-Tucker better served at tackle, or is he better served at guard? And do the Jets even have a choice if he's better served at guard? Are they going to be in a position where they'll be pressed into playing Vera-Tucker at tackle? What's amazing to me is that despite all this, nobody even talks about Fant. I think that's kind of telling. And, it brings me no pleasure to speak like this because you may remember George Fant actually did an interview on Locked On Jets back in December, and he was great. It was a great interview. I thought, he was a great guy. It was a really enjoyable interview with George. I just don't know that this is the right move for the Jets bringing him back. And it kind of feels like if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. I think Fant even kind of, he did not expressly say this, but he's kind of hinted, even in the training camp in the preseason, he kind of hinted at his frustration at the lack of progress on a new contract with the Jets. I look at what's happened this season. If the Jets were not really willing to re-sign him after 2021, and I have to be honest, I think that's a move I agree with from the standpoint that I think that they needed to see more. Based on Fant's career, he had the one good season, and I think that they needed to see a second good season to really confirm that this was an ascending player and it wasn't just a random, career year. And based on what we saw in 22, and again, some of it was probably based on injury, some of it was probably based on other factors. Jets did not have a lot of stability on their offensive line this year, but based on what we saw on 22, I think you would probably have to conclude that 21 was just a career season for Fant, one that he might not be able to replicate again. He's not the worst tackle in the world, and I think that there's value in having a guy who at least is somewhat credible. Because if you put a guy out there who just can't block at all, and you can think through Jets history, Wayne Hunter is a good example. If you have a guy that just cannot block at all, it can destroy your offense. I don't think Fant is a guy who destroys your offense. I don't think he misses blocks at a rate that he gives your offense no chance to succeed. But it feels like he's going to want a fairly decent contract in free agency this year. And that's understandable because there is a lack of offensive line talent across the league. So it is a seller's market on the offensive line. I think the Jets have to try and do better. And maybe that they have to pick somebody at 13 at the tackle position. But I just don't think you can go into this season with Fant as your tackle. And again, I think it's kind of telling that for all the issues the Jets have at tackle, nobody's even suggested it. And there's been no suggestions that the Jets have even had any sort of contract discussions with Fant. I think that it's pretty clear that the Jets and Fant are going to move on from each other this offseason. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out this Friday show, and I'll give you one more player I do not think the Jets should bring back. I don't think this is going to be a controversial one. I think it's another weakness on the defense. It's the safety position. Who knows, though? Maybe you feel strongly about LaMarcus Joyner returning. I don't, and I'll explain why I think the Jets should move on as we continue this Friday Locked On Jets episode. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. You've heard me talk about this mobile game, and it's a lot of fun. Well, now it's your turn to compete, but more on that later. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? You can decide which free agents you don't want to bring back. Well, your dream can come true, and this game's definitely for you. You'll manage every strategic aspect of your team and play through seasons. You'll lead your team to glory, trying to build a dynasty. Because with Ultimate Football GM, you're responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise. You have to hire the right coaches and coordinators, you trade players, you navigate your franchise through free agency and the draft and all the ups and downs of the season. And it's all in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. You can play on the go as you want and when you want to. And we've created the Ultimate Locked On League for you to compete against Locked On fans all over the world. Can you be the ultimate Locked On Football GM? Choose the Locked On League in the app to join. Can you create a football dynasty? And Locked On Jets listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code Locked On, all caps, in the game store. Again, that's Locked On, it's one word in all caps. Make sure to check it out today. And to download the game, just go to ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. Again, that's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. Here on this Friday, we're talking about players who are about to become free agents for the Jets who I think the team should move on from. I've begun the show on a controversial note by talking about Quincy Williams. We got less controversial talking about George Fant, and I think this will be the least controversial player of all, a player who had a fairly big role on the Jets in 2022, and that's LaMarcus Joyner. Now, I don't know, maybe there are some big LaMarcus Joyner fans out there. Maybe there are some people who are adamant that the Jets should keep LaMarcus Joyner. I would really like to hear from you because I would love to know why. Joyner's been on the Jets for 2 years, and I think it's fair to say it really has not worked out. Year one was tough. He suffered an injury the first half of the first game, an injury that pretty much ended the season. And heading into that year, it felt like the Jets were very excited about him. I mean, I heard comparisons that he could be the Jimmy Ward of this defense. Ward was a safety who played a big role in the success Robert Saleh had in San Francisco. And then he gets injured again in the first quarter, the first game in Carolina in 21, and is out for the season. Jets brought him back, and it was a risky move at the time the Jets did it, because this was a guy who not only was in his 30s and not only coming off a season-ending injury, but really had not been a full-time safety in about 4 years heading into the 2022 season, because he had spent a lot of time as a slot corner with a couple other teams. So he was kind of returning to the safety spot and got off to a horrible start. I mean, he had a terrible first 3 weeks. Then he had a big week 4 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Had a couple of interceptions. And did have his moments through the season, but ultimately I don't think was the right guy for the Jets at the back of their defense. And part of me wants to give the Jets a pass on bringing him back, because safety was probably a spot where they had to take a chance on somebody. They did bring in Jordan Whitehead as well, and they just, for all the resources they had a year ago, they did not have enough resources to fix all of their needs. They had to pretty much hope that there was going to be some low-cost guy who could stabilize the safety position. Unfortunately, I don't think Joyner did that. And I think that the Jets' defensive success, it was based on the defensive line. I think it was based on the corner play. I think the linebackers and the safeties were kind of shaky. You got a bunch of things working against Joyner. First, he's going to be 33 during the season. Yes, he knows the scheme, but he hasn't really shown an ability to execute the scheme well for his role. I don't know where the Jets go with the safety position. I think it's a spot where they've had some trouble filling it, and they really should not have had this much trouble filling it. This gets me to my other point. It feels like there's always a credible safety available. Safety is not a position where guys typically get paid big money, and for good reason. There just are not many impact safeties in the league. So when I talk about positional values, one of the things I talk about frequently is how positions are not equal in the NFL. There are some positions that are more important than others. One of the reasons for that is that there are certain positions where it's just tough to find impact players, and that's maybe due to the mechanics of the NFL. Part of it, I think, is we talked about in the linebacker segment about Quincy Williams, about how it's difficult to find linebackers who can cover tight ends and running backs one-on-one. I think the same is true of safeties. In a bygone era, I think the safety position was more important, and I think a guy who hit hard, a guy who could deliver the big hit over the receivers going over the middle, the guy who could come up and play the run, that was an important part of a defense. But the NFL has moved in a different direction. First of all, it's moved in a direction, and this has been true for decades. The deeper we get into NFL history, the more and more relevant the passing game becomes. So a guy who plays the run isn't as valuable. And aside from that, just the rule changes for player safety reasons has kind of reduced what you need out of a safety as far as delivering the big hit goes. These are all considerations. I don't know. So what this does is it means that it's not as hard to find a credible safety out there. It's one of those positions that it always feels to be like in June, there's a guy or two at the safety position who's still available. And I say, well, how's he still available? He's a pretty good player. But the thing is, it's just not that hard to find somebody. And I think that there are good reasons for that. And I don't think the Jets should be going to 33-year-old Joyner off the year he just had. Because while there were good games, there were also some inconsistent games. There were moments where he missed tackles. There were moments where he took a bad angle. And that's something you can't do at the safety position. And that's the other thing about safety play is because of the way the NFL televises these games, because of the camera angles they show, a lot of the times the safety isn't even in your view. So when he's doing his job effectively, you usually don't notice him because he's essentially locking down the deep part of the field, maybe either a deep half or the deep middle third of the field. You usually only notice him unless it's more of a box type guy, but you only notice the deep type safeties if they're making a mistake because they've overrun a play and a bad play is turned into a catastrophe. And I feel like there were just too many moments where Joyner did not do his job effectively. I also think the Jets, if they're going to keep Jordan Whitehead, they need to get a bigger safety in here. I don't think they want mismatches in the red zone against big tight ends when they play man coverage. I think that's an issue. I think you can't. I think it's tough to have an undersized safety duo, and I think Joyner did not help them a lot in that area. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on the podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Friday, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.